Good evening and welcome to chapters 19 and 20. So tonight's discussion question is, what makes you read past the first chapter of a book? Basically, we've all been there. You pick up a book, you've got no idea how much you are going to enjoy it or if you're going to enjoy it. And there's something that makes you decide within the first few pages or maybe first few chapters whether or not you're going to carry on and read the rest of the whole thing. So what is the thing that makes you decide whether or not you actually do carry on with it? So, chapter 19, the last thing that happened. First off, in a city, New London, the Lord introduced himself and stole just about all of the weaponry that belonged to the Underdogs. So that puts them in a bit of a pickle. And meanwhile, outside of New London, Raj and the rest of the Underdogs finally struck on Lieutenant Lambourne's headquarters, only to find that everyone there was already dead. And Lieutenant Lambourne has been killed by Keith Tyler for some unknown reason, and the only thing that they can really be sure of is that Shannon wasn't being taken to Lambourne's headquarters, she was being taken from there. So chapter 19 does give a little bit more insight as to what exactly happened, because it's from the perspective of Ian Marshall, the head of military. So without further ado, let's go. Chapter 19. Ian Marshall approached the door, an impatient march in his step left over from his army days. It was a time for actions rather than meetings, but nonetheless a meeting had been called, and it made no sense for the architect to meet him as low down as floor G. Nearly 48 hours had passed since the rebels had broken into the inner city, and the hole in the wall had not yet been fixed. So yeah, this is like 2 days after the previous chapters. It may have been guarded day and night with bio-rifle soldiers, more about them in a bit, but Marshall had more faith in reinforced concrete. He walked through the door to find Nathaniel Pierce on the other side. That alone made his day worse. Grant's head of military stood less than a metre from his chief of scientific research, and the tension between them could be sensed like the push of two repelling magnets. Marshall noticed the window to his left, and realised why he was on floor G, the level that held the interrogation chambers. He was on the comfortable side of the two-way mirror, away from the clinically tiled floors and the polished tables of tools and blades. Through the glass, Oliver Roth danced a knife between his fingers in front of a suitably terrified man. "Who the hell is that?" asked Marshall. "Your 14-year-old assassin," replied Pierce. "The man next to him, you simpleton. Adnan Shah." "Who the hell is Adnan Shah?" "The architectural consultant for the Northern Wall," said Pierce. 2 days have passed without a full repair, so I thought a little professional encouragement was needed. A scream came from the other side of the mirror. Marshall grunted to himself. "Nat," he started, "I know military strategy isn't your strong point, so let me give you some friendly advice. There's no point in tormenting someone without a crystal clear objective. Before you go diving in with knives, you have to know what you want first." "Maybe you should give your boy the same advice." Marshall glanced at Oliver Roth, who seemed to be enjoying himself. There was no denying Pierce's point. "So what's your objective?" Marshall asked. "To make Shah snap his fingers and instantly fix the wall? We're not talking about those clones you grow in a couple of hours. Materials take time to gather. Walls take time to reconstruct. Wet concrete takes time to set." "Yes," said Pierce. "He tried telling us that." And hello, Maria. And Elia. So already, obviously it doesn't tell me who is watching and where they are, but it does if they're, first off, if they actually say hello, and secondly, if they're on my friends list. So I already know that this is being listened to by people in Britain, the Netherlands, and Argentina. Marshall frowned from one corner of his mouth. It was dumbfounding to think that once upon a time, Nathaniel Pierce had been his best friend. Marshall Contractors, later Marshall Pierce Solutions, had been the perfect recovery from 12 years in the armed forces, followed by a bloody dangerous career as an arms dealer. Positive relationships meant everything in that profession, and when the warlords started to grow weary of Marshall, running a safe business at home seemed like the way to go. So I was just distracted by my computer informing me that I am live. Thank you for the notification. And that one too. It was better to quit while you were still alive. He had pulled Pierce from the teeth of bankruptcy, a move that seemed like a good idea at the time. Ian and Nat made a fortune together until a well-mannered, eccentric character by the name of Nicholas Grant walked in, bought the company, and walked out again. Neither Marshall nor Pierce could get their heads around it. The son of Francis Grant, oil tycoon billionaire, had cashed out and switched professions. Most people in the dying fossil fuel industry had jumped ship to the rise of renewable energy, but Nicholas Grant just bought a security company. It was inexplicable. Another yell from behind the glass returned Marshall to his senses. We don't have time for this, Marshall said. Don't wet yourself, said Pierce. He's made of flesh, and flesh has nerve cells. He'll give in. And do what? Admit his incompetence. We can't just shoot him because concrete takes too long to dry. It'd be unfair dismissal. Marshall shot Pierce a disgusted glare. That's your objective? Get him to incriminate himself, then replace him with someone else? He's had 2 days, Ian. Marshall looked through the mirror at the man who pleaded for a chance to do his job, tormented by the same teenage boy who had fired the laser cannon through his wall in the first place. Marshall truly missed the Oliver Roth that he had first come to know, the handsome 12-year-old with a brilliant intellect and taste for adventure. Plucking him out of Marshall Pierce's youth training program had been a brave but foolhardy move. A long story, and one which Nicholas Grant could never find out about. But you do find out about it in the sequel, funnily enough. But that cheeky, daring boy was gone, replaced by the teenager behind the glass. Like child stars who grew up in the limelight and became drug addicts, Oliver Roth had neither the wisdom nor the role models to know how to handle his newfound power. Never thought of Miss Keith Tyler, Marshall thought towards himself. The man may have been impossible to get on with, but he had been far more professional in carrying out his business. The thought of Tyler triggered a separate issue in his head. Half a week had passed since the incident, and it was time to stop avoiding the issue. We need to talk about Shannon, he said. By the way, if you can hear those buzzes from my phone, it's because my family WhatsApp is going wild and the rest of the family is talking to each other. So, yeah, sorry about that. We need to talk about Shannon, he said. Pierce gave him eye contact for the first time in weeks, the surprise visible in his face. What about her? It's time we admitted she might be a problem. A dead problem, Ian. Have you seen her body? Pierce gave no answer, and turned his head back to the horror show. Here are the facts, Marshall continued regardless. First, Keith called me from Hartford, telling me he'd killed everyone except her. Including little Lambo, I remember. Marshall nodded with a discreet frown. As professional as Tyler had been, Marshall dreaded to think what he had done to Anthony Lambourne in the end. Then later that evening, he continued, he called half a mile from New London, asking for access through the security gate. He hung up in a rush, saying something about Shannon killing his clones. She grabbed a knife and killed them while he was distracted by the phone. Maybe Lambo taught her some of his fancy pants knife stuff. Or maybe the clones are under orders not to hurt her. Anyway, that was the last I ever heard from him. A few hours later, he stopped checking in, and my scouting team found his body later that night. 100-ish stab wounds. Shannon killed him single-handed, so I'm willing to bet she's still alone out there. Even Nick isn't asking us to search for her. If the great Nicholas Grant says she's not a problem, she's not a problem. Nick was always tricky when it came to Shannon, muttered Marshall. Maybe he does and doesn't want her dead. Well, she is dead, Ian, said Pierce. She had one chance at survival, and she stabbed it to death. She's more resourceful than you think. Lambo was the resourceful one. Shannon was a jumped-up bystander. And now she's a dead bystander, who probably died of thirst in a field somewhere. She's not dead until I see her body. Then send your boy, Pierce finished with his trademark smarmy grin. If he gets stabbed to death too, we'll know you're right. Marshall had spent a whole military career keeping his impulses under control, and 8 years as an arms dealer being patient with monstrous people. At that moment he did neither. Instead, he raised a clenched fist and smashed it into Nathaniel Pierce's nose. Pierce barely remained on his feet, and clutched his face as 2 nostrils worth of blood began to dribble. The look in his face was one of surprise rather than shock or horror. You apathetic, feeble-minded moron, yelled Marshall as his former best friend steadied himself. You imprison and torture the best man for fixing the wall, the most useful guy on our payroll right now, including you. You use one of my staff to do your dirty work, then joke about him dying like Keith. You make assumptions about Shannon based on nothing more than wishful thinking. You have literally no idea how to solve anything unless you can throw clones at it. Now listen to me, because I'm telling you what's going to happen with the wall. Pierce took his hand away from his wreck of a nose and listened as if the punch had never happened. "First off," said Marshall, "Oliver's going to let Shah go and pretend the whole thing was just a warning. Then you let him get back to work. We keep the bio-rifle soldiers in place at the hole right up until Shah tells us the concrete is set. In the meantime, Grant wants the prisoners dead right now, and I've got a plan. The daily food drops in half an hour, and we're going to disappoint them." There came another scream, blunted by the double-glazed window, then an audible sentence from Roth, punctuated with laughter. Marshall bit his lip. "Worried about him?" Pierce asked with a grin. Marshall sneered. "It's times like this I'm glad to spend my life in the violence business," he said, "rather than shutting himself away in a lab somewhere. Bet this freaks you out." "Honestly, it doesn't," Pierce replied, with very little emotion to show for his words. "I spent my life in biological science, and my clone research was so secret that I didn't even look for ethics approval. So I've dissected apes for anatomical research. I've poisoned dogs alongside clones just to compare how their bodies react to ice and gas. I performed autopsies on clones that I've personally put to death, or just close to death in some cases." Marshall gave no response beyond a blank expression, as Pierce withdrew a handkerchief from his shirt pocket and wiped the blood from his face. "Truthfully," Pierce said, "when I look in there, all I see is meat. And meat doesn't scare me." New scene. Ewan checked his watch again, as discreetly as he could. It was one of his last remaining possessions. 11 o'clock, April 27th. Feeding time. Bloody hell, we've been trapped in this wool pressure cooker for nearly 2 days. He had joined Charlie and Kate in a mass gathering for the daily food drop, accompanied by Patrick and Ruth. They had left Jack and the sons in the shelter to guard the rucksack of gadgets. "Oh, hey Andy." Besides the binoculars, door combination hacker, and the other non-combat tools, it contained 2 more smoke grenades and a small stick of dynamite. They'd be a fat lot of good inside the inner city, but they were still worth guarding. Ewan found himself among a growing crowd of emaciated faces, who had been forced on an 11-month diet of just enough food but little more. Grant may have ensured there was enough for all, but some had managed to seize more than others. Yeah, this is kind of like the coronavirus panic buying, except on a rather desperate, literally deadly scale. "I wonder if they'll send me some birthday cake tomorrow," Charlie joked at his side. "They'll do that for me, won't they? For my sweet 16th? Oh, great, he's making jokes about imprisonment. The first step towards accepting it. "Pretty sure it'll be the same as yesterday," Patrick answered. "Bread, processed biscuit, bottled water, and mass-farmed veg. Sorry, Charlie." "What's the time?" asked Ruth. "Exactly 11, answered Ewan. "They're later than yesterday. Can't even see them in the distance." His eyes wandered to his podcopter wound. It didn't look good. He had taken the bandage off a few hours ago to find that his forearm had changed colour. It was infected, not a shadow of a doubt, and the surface of his skin looked like it was crying out for help. He had hidden the wound from his friends as much as possible, as well as his terrified reaction. Another week without Lorraine's medicines, and the infection would do Grant's job for him. Ewan looked among the crowd and saw 1,000 faces as worried as his. "What's up?" he whispered. "This is the first time the food's ever been late," whispered Patrick. "After nearly a year. Literally the first time." Ewan glanced around and caught 3 separate people looking at him. Even after 2 days, the stares from the locals were still frequent. Ewan and his friends had spent most of their lives being stared at, but this time it was different. There were 4 combat-suited teenagers in a world without soldiers, known only for their sudden appearance from nowhere. People were curious, but afraid to ask. Ewan turned and tapped his friends on the shoulders. "We should leave," he whispered. "What?" asked Kate. "You're not hungry?" "The food's not coming, and the reason doesn't even matter. When a crowd gets scared, they blame the odd ones out." Kate and Charlie wasted no time in following him, as the crowd's whispers grew in the air like the build-up of static electricity. In the 5 minutes it took to get to the Rowlands' house, Ewan was astonished at the deafening volume 1,000 whispers could reach. Jack rose from his seat in surprise. "What happened? Food fairy didn't come?" "Yeah, something like that." Aidan and Benjamin looked at one another, sharing the same anxious faces as the crowd outside. Ewan beckoned the Underdogs together, and they huddled in the middle of the room like a sports team before a tense match. "Things need to change," he began, with droplets of sweat emerging on his forehead. "And fast. McCormick must think we're dead. Grant's up to something with the food, and before long the locals will turn on us. And we're putting the Rowlands in danger by sheltering under their roof." "Then there's your arm," said Jack. You need antibiotics or you'll be dead in a week. Ewan stared at him, wide-eyed. You didn't think we'd notice? Asked Kate. We've got to break out. For your sake, even if nothing else. It wasn't a subject Ewan wanted to talk about, but he smiled on the inside. It was good to have friends looking out for him. That hole we made to the outer city, he said. It's the only way out. Now why on earth didn't we think of that before? Asked Charlie with exaggerated sarcasm. Because an hour after we broke in, we lost our weapons. There's a right way to get through that hole, but it's not by copying the locals. The clones covered the hole with wood so they can rebuild it from the inside, which means they won't see us approaching. The time's running out. Jack took the group's last 2 pistols from his belt and held one tightly in each hand. I'm up for it if you are, he said, but the probability of success is pretty much 0. Not if we get the minigun back, said Ewan. I'm going to find the Lord. It's time to negotiate. End of chapter 19. Okay, so again, tonight's discussion question: what is it that makes you read past the first chapter of, well, anything you're reading, fiction or non-fiction? My personal answer: first off, you gotta like the characters. I've always believed that you can have the most amazing storyline that the human brain could possibly come up with, but if you have really boring characters, then who's going to care? Also, writing style plays a large part. If I find that the sentences are barely accessible, then that's not going to encourage me to read on. But also, I'd like to know what the story is actually going to be about, and a part of that is getting into the action as quickly as realistically possible. I don't tend to get on very well with books that spend the first 4 or 5 chapters just setting the scene. And unpopular opinion, but I was very close to not liking To Kill a Mockingbird simply because almost nothing happens in the first half. I do recognise it for the extremely important book that it is, and once it gets to the trial, it's completely gripping. But hi Ben. But I don't tend. I suppose you could call me impatient. I just don't tend to like books that take ages to get into the action. It doesn't have to get into the action straight away in the complete absence of any plot points or world building, but there should be something that attracts us to read on, other than just expecting us to be patient enough to wait for chapter 10 for things to start happening. Anyway, if you've got any comments of your own, feel free to leave them in the comments, whether you're watching this live later on or on YouTube. And with that said, I'm going to take a sip of my drink and then start chapter 20. Chapter 20. Half of the crowd had dispersed by the time Ewan made his journey. The other half had probably worked out that their owners didn't plan to feed them that day, but their desperation was powerful enough to keep them in place. Ewan stood 100 metres from the Lord's current shelter, his hands fidgeting beyond his control. You don't have to do this, said Charlie at his side. You're betting your life on it working. We'll never break out with 2 handguns. And besides, Ewan said, showing his arm with its pus-filled sacks lining the podcopter wound, I'd rather die today if I'm dying at all. Ewan had already said his goodbyes to Kate, Jack and the Rowlands, pretending not to believe they were final. Kate had demanded he go unarmed, claiming that the Lord would see any weapon as a sign of aggression rather than protection. Her insistence had only triggered Ewan's PDA, and guaranteed he would be defiant enough to take one. He wondered how much of his defiance had been because of her relationship with Raj. Over the last couple of days, he had come to realise that his warm feelings for Kate were friendship rather than romance. But she had still turned him down. That was okay. She had every right to, and in her position, Ewan would have done the same. But he wasn't going to lie to himself and pretend it didn't hurt. But he had taken the news better than he had predicted, largely because he cared about Kate and her right to make her own decisions. Ewan may have had a great myriad of problems, but misogyny was not one of them. His parents had left him under no illusions about the importance of respecting women. Maybe Mum and Dad were lucky. If Major George West and his wife were going to die anywhere, at least they died without seeing this place. Maria said, absolutely. I feel if I can understand the author's voice in the beginning, I'm intrigued enough to continue. Yep, I agree. And hello, Amy. Julie says, for me, it's about who's introduced, any backstory hints, how smooth it reads. It's the way the writer writes it that's important to me. You can tell who, author-wise, puts their heart and soul in. So I just had to press Seymour and then I've lost my place. Oh, here we go. Into a book by the first chapter or two. Those that really have thought it through and are able to reel you in one chapter, they make you want more, and they make you feel it's personal somehow. You start to relate to characters quickly, and you want to know more about them. Those are the books I know I love, and I like this, and get a book hangover from. I love the phrase book hangover. It's like when you finish reading a book and the rest of the universe is just carrying on as if nothing's happened. It's like the most recent Game of Thrones book, where one of the major characters dies. I read that in the middle of the staff room at one lunchtime. I just looked up and the rest of the staff were just carrying on with their day as if this character hadn't just died. But yeah, once you finish, you're left thinking, oh, I'm going to need to take some time for myself before reading anything else. Yeah, I like those books. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah. How are you feeling? Asked Charlie. I mean, stupid question, I know, but it's fine to be scared. Ewan closed his eyes and tried his best to put his thoughts into words. I know that death should scare me, he started, but it doesn't. There's something scarier, and I've seen it here. What's that? It was a topic he didn't feel comfortable discussing, but somehow it seemed okay to tell his temper twin. Death's bad enough, Ewan said, but surviving and losing your humanity? Tiptoeing around death long enough to lose yourself as a person? It's happened to people I've met here. It happened to the Lord and his guys. If you stay here, it'll happen to you too. That's my biggest fear, including death. Charlie placed a hand on Ewan's shoulder. Affection was rare from Charlie. He neither gave hugs in his best moods nor received them in his worst. Before Oakenfold, Charlie said, the teacher spent years trying to make us act like everyone else. We couldn't do it back then, and we won't do it now. Hello, Martin. Ewan couldn't help but smile. His friend had a point. Charlie, he said, there's something I need to give you. I don't do kisses, mate. Yeah, as if you're my type. Here, take this. Shannon's USB stick had been zipped inside Ewan's left pocket for 2 days, his hand patting it once an hour to double, triple and quadruple check it was still there. He fetched it out, the words better days worn and smudged, and handed it to Charlie. I don't have a clue what to do with this. If this meeting goes wrong but you guys escape anyway, work out what to do. Charlie bit his lip, but took the device from his friend regardless. This doesn't give you permission to die, he said. It's not your permission to give. Anyway, you've still got your phone, right? Yeah? Take photos of this place. The others need to see what the prisoners are going through. Then go to the toilet block and guard Kate while she phones McCormick. Charlie took a confused step backwards. The constant threat of tracking technology had kept their phones in their pockets for 2 days straight. In Grant's position, Ewan would have been scanning the whole citadel non-stop, waiting for the Underdogs to give their location away by phoning home. You sure? Charlie asked. One frequency scan and we're caught. It's been 2 days. They might have given up scanning for us. But knowing McCormick, he'll have kept the comms unit guarded since the beginning. He deserves to know we're alive. Why don't you make the call before you leave? You know, just in case. Because I'm leaving now. Besides, it might be Raj who answers. Yeah, so? I kind of made a move on his girlfriend a few days ago. He doesn't know, but I'd feel awkward. Just do this for me, mate. Ewan took advantage of Charlie's confused pause and started his jog. According to the Rowlands, the Lord and his henchmen didn't have a home. The last gang in power had made that mistake. Don Maggio and his mafia-style family might as well have drawn a giant target on the door of their shelter, and were helpless when the Lord, Dave, Sean, Gareth and Potts struck in the early hours. The Lord had learned from Don Maggio's mistake, and commanded his empire under the roof of a different prisoner each night. It kept him safe from planned attacks, and his subordinates were forced to see their self-proclaimed master face to face while personally catering for his needs. But Ewan didn't take long to find him. He had never seen the bodyguards' faces, but he recognised superiority complex when he saw it. The guards were stood on the thin streets as if they owned them. He had no idea which henchman he met eyes with, but it did not matter. The four couldn't have shared a full personality between them. If you spend enough time pretending to be someone you're not, eventually your real personality fades away. It's happened to these guys, and now their tough guy disguises are the only part of them left. Sad, really. Stood before a tall, shaven-headed bringer of death, he did his best to remember that he was the great Ewan West, the leader of countless charges against the greatest foe Britain had ever known. Oh, and the young man who had destroyed a podcopter with his bare hands. "I would like to speak to the Lord," he breathed, in a voice that balanced respect and confidence in the best way he knew how. It was difficult, given that he didn't respect them and didn't feel confident either. His polite gesture was met with a predictable flurry of hands searching his body, and he was pinned against the wall by the muzzles of half a dozen firearms. He recognised 3 of the guns from the armoury back at Spitfire's Rise, one of which had the knife mark he had placed there himself. He suppressed his bubbling anger as well as he could. That had been his weapon, even among his peers. The Lord poked an interested pair of eyes around the entrance, saw Ewan's combat gear, and grinned. "Parasites armed," a henchman snarled. Ewan felt a sharp jerk from the back of his trousers as his handgun was ripped from its holster, and he heard the cocking of several firearms before the Lord raised a firm hand. "You don't touch him, Potts," he said. "That's our leader. If he wants to chat, you can have on. Disarm him and let him in." After a search for bladed weapons, Ewan was permitted inside the house under armed guard for Potts and one of the others. Ewan was permitted inside the house under armed guard from Potts and one of the others. The Lord sat in the centre of the one-roomed shelter. Don't know what's up with my tongue today. At a table that had once been somebody's back door, the original homeowner sat trembling at his side. "So you come here to kill me," the Lord said without aggression or alarm. "That's not the way I do things." "Then what are you doing here, whatever your name is?" "West. Private West." Ewan hoped that faking a military background would earn a little respect. He knew enough from his father to blag his way through most questions. "Bit young, ain't you?" "I've come with peaceful intentions on behalf of my squaddies," Ewan continued, "to ask for our minigun back. You have my word, it will never be used against you or your interests." The Lord spat out a laugh, so sudden and so loud that the other two henchmen ran to the door. "You know, there was something wrong with every sentence there. You came in peace carrying a gun. You asked for your minigun when it fell from the sky. You say you won't act against our interests while asking for our biggest weapon. Does this mean you won't negotiate?" The Lord gave a loose glance to the ceiling, considering the question. He then pointed a thumb towards their frightened host, who sat deep in his seat as if magnetised to it, and spoke to one of his men. "Dave, get rid of him." His command was followed by a single bullet, fired from the gun that had once belonged to Charlie. With no time for a reaction before he died, the homeowner fell from his chair with the same scared expression on his face. "You idiot!" the Lord shouted, rising from his stool. "I meant to get him out of the house, not get rid of him." "Oh," answered Dave. "Sorry, bruv. You just said—" "I just what?" "Nothing, mate. Sorry." "Put him outside. Sean, help him." "Hey, Tom." Dave tucked Charlie's weapon back in his belt and nudged for Sean to help him with the body. The Lord returned his glance to Ewan, the dead host forever gone from his mind. In the short silence that followed, Ewan realised he had been no more shocked by the man's death than the Lord had been. The inner city was eating his humanity, and the fear he had confessed to Charlie had taken gentle steps closer to reality. He had to get his team out of there. "I spent my whole life thinking I was less human than other people, thanks to everyone telling me my brain was faulty. Today, I'm fighting to remain one of the most human people in New London." "So you came to negotiate," continued the Lord. "But there's nothing to say. You've nothing to offer me." "There's a way out of the citadel," said Ewan, his heart leaping up his chest when he realised he had interrupted the Lord. "But not without weapons. You have my word as an honourable British soldier. If you return our weapons, we will fight our way out and you will never see us again." The Lord's expression changed, his lips pressing together and his eyebrows deepening. Ewan tried to read his scarred face, but it was difficult to interpret. Did he think Ewan was lying? Insane? Did he see this as a pathetic attempt at deceit? "Tell me the way out, Private," he commanded. "You must have seen that hole in the outer city wall," answered Ewan. The one that's been boarded up, about to be concreted, with scum soldiers guarding every square inch of it?" Ewan noticed that the Lord had lost his grunting, lazy tone. He sounded like an actual person with a hint of a Welsh accent. "Hello, Noreen, and thank you for the compliment." "Every day there's a nice pile of bodies building up beneath it," the Lord continued. "They all had the same idea as you. They weren't armed." "You won't be either," answered the Lord as he slouched back and put his feet up on the dead man's chair, "because there's no way in hell you're taking our weapons. Why would you want to escape anyway? There's nothing out there anymore. Here we've got free food, no taxes, no morning rush hour, no parking tickets, and no reality TV. Living the dream. Living your dream, nobody else's. Our friends are on the outside, Ewan answered, and we have to get back to them. Then why'd you come here in the first place? Unhappy accident. Look, mate, you say there's nothing I can offer, but there is. You'd get to have a front row seat and watching loads of enemy soldiers getting slaughtered. You and your friends can watch in glee as those prison guards get what's coming to them. Tell me honestly, can you really resist that? The early stages of a smile broke across the Lord's face. His bodyguards at the entrance had full grins. Ewan had walked into the wolves' lair just hoping to get out in one piece, but found himself on the winning side of a negotiation. His optimism was shot down by the Lord's response. It's like this, Private. That'll be nice to watch, but only today. Tomorrow the guards will be replaced, we'll be left without our biggest weapon, and the fatherless are just dying for a chance to jump us and take power. We're keeping our guns, mate, and there's not a damn thing on earth you can say to make me change my mind. The Lord stood up from his chair and headed for the entrance door, bringing the moment Ewan had feared the most, his attempt to leave. But the thing is, the Lord finished, I respect you. You're not actually a bad guy. You ain't getting your weapons, but I'll let you live. Have fun in town, Private West. Ewan dared to smile as he stood up. The Lord has blessed me with the gift of life, he thought with a grin. I wonder if Raj would find that funny. He had taken 3 steps towards the doorframe when a voice boomed out from loudspeakers across the citadel. It must have echoed from one end of the inner city to the other. The Lord and his henchmen leapt in shock. Such announcements must have been rare. Ladies and gentlemen of the citadel, this is Nicholas Grant. Nicholas bloody Grant. Up to that moment, Ewan had only known the tyrant as a name and a reputation. Suddenly he had a real voice, and it violated his ears with deafening power and clarity. You've starved your people for half a day, Ewan thought. What have you been building up to? Today's delivery of food and water has been cancelled, continued the voice of Nicholas Grant, and all future deliveries have been suspended. Now, those of you in the northern region may have noticed the sudden presence of 4 strangers. These teenagers are dangerous, to my soldiers and to all of you. Ewan's feet anchored themselves to the ground in fright, and his stomach started to weaken. Grant's voice oozed confidence and authority, in a way that the Lord and even McCormick never managed. These strangers are named as follows, said Grant. Charlie Coleman, a troublesome boy with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and uncontrolled anger issues. Kate Arrowsmith, an autistic school dropout with severe anxiety disorder. Jack Hopper, a teenager with Asperger's syndrome who has failed in 2 suicide attempts so far. And their leader is Ewan West, a 16-year-old problem child with autism and pathological demand avoidance who was permanently expelled from 6 different schools. Making us sound as worthless as possible. I know where you're going with this. Ewan checked the walls for other exits, but found none. The Lord was standing at the entrance, his expression morphing from respect to hostility. A pistol lay gripped in his hand. They both knew Grant's final sentences before they were spoken. These 4 are your enemies, Grant finished, as the Lord raised his handgun to the height of Ewan's forehead. And you will put these parasites to death. There will be no more food or water drops anywhere across New London until I have recovered all 4 of their dead bodies. And that's the end of chapter 20. My best friend has a bit of a nickname for me based on her reaction to that chapter. I know that there might be kids watching this, so I can't quite say what it is, but the first of it's 2 words long, and the first word is utter. So, yeah, Ewan's in a little bit of trouble, and I'm loving seeing all these wow reactions coming in. Quite a few people are a little bit surprised by that twist. Dane's just gone boo. I'm assuming that's a boo rather than a boo, but yeah, thank you. As a writer, I'm kind of glad you're frustrated by it. Anyway, you're going to have to wait until tomorrow to find out how that resolves. And other than that, yeah, thanks for watching. And yeah, it was interesting reading out the voice of Nicholas Grant, because that's the first time he appears in any form, visual or auditory, in the whole book. In my head, Nicholas Grant is definitely played by Peter Capaldi. I can't do a Scottish accent, so you just got my deep commanding voice for it. But yeah, in my head, Nicholas Grant is played by Peter Capaldi. He's got the enthusiastic but rather bad-tempered nature to him. And Noreen says, great last paragraph. Thank you very much. And thanks, Julie, for posting the links. For those who aren't currently following Underdogs on Facebook, there's a link there. It's up to 1,150 people now, which is great. And quite a few people have subscribed to my YouTube channel as well in recent days, which coincidentally is also up to 1,150. So it's weird when the numbers line up like that. But yeah, thanks very much. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Take care.